There's a really amazing thing that happens for anyone who reads The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for the first time. It's the moment when you realize that there's actually more to the story than just the words on the page. There's a whole undercurrent of deeper meaning just beneath the surface. And for most people, that's the moment that they say, "Oh, now I get it. Narnia is an allegory." And you'll even find this claim in online articles, blog posts, and even in the pages of textbooks. But is that right? Is Narnia actually an allegory? And what exactly is an allegory anyway? Well, these are actually very important questions because only when you understand them can you actually begin to understand how to read Narnia the right way. And I'll just go ahead and give you the answer right now. No, Narnia is not an allegory, despite what your 8th grade literature teacher may have told you. And today, I'll explain why it's really much more interesting and more important than you might have realized. Now, to be honest, understanding how to read and think critically seems to be a lost art for many young adults today. And that's why a place like Boyce College is so important for young people who want to make a faithful investment in their formative college years. You see, Boyce College in Louisville prepares graduates for the what and the who they will be after college. Now, one way Boyce accomplishes this is through a life of discipleship. What students learn in class and during chapel gets lived out on campus and in the community. Each student is required to actively participate in a local church. There are dozens of biblically faithful churches located only minutes from campus, and Boyce College will happily help make that connection. Now, you can learn more about Boyce College by visiting boycecollege.com/faith. And thanks to Boyce for sponsoring today's video. And also thanks to my amazing community of supporters at Patreon. Now, these are the people who believe in the goodness of this channel enough to invest their time and energy in keeping it running. Now, if you'd like to join this community, check us out at patreon.com/intothewardrobe. Now, it's time to leave the Shadowlands behind and step into a world that's more real than our own. It's time to follow me into the wardrobe. You know, it's easy to understand why many readers of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe assume that the book's an allegory, specifically a Christian allegory about the person and work of Jesus Christ. After all, there are so many symbols and parallels for the New Testament story, some so blatantly obvious it can be downright cringy. And by the way, there are tons of spoilers here, so be warned. Now, to begin with, there's Aslan, who obviously represents Christ. He's the son of the great emperor across the sea, and Christ is the son of God in heaven. Jesus is called the Lion of Judah, and Aslan is, well, a lion. Prophecies are foretold about the coming of Aslan to save Narnia, just as the great prophets like Isaiah and others foretold the coming of Christ to save the world. But the most obvious parallel is that Aslan sacrificed his own life, the life of an innocent, to save the life of a traitor, just as Christ, who knew no sin, gave his life to save the life of those who had rebelled against God. Okay, so it seems obvious that Aslan represents Jesus, so what else is allegorical? Well, there's a stone table for one, which is kind of like a cross, and sort of like the 10 Commandments too, and kind of like the Hebrew sacrificial altar. And then there's Jadis, who represents the devil, right? Like the Turkish delight represents the fruit that Adam and Eve ate, except Narnia was already fallen before Edmund ate the Turkish delight. Okay, well, Edmund, he's obviously Judas, except Judas ended up hanging himself. No, let's just stop. I think you get the picture, right? When you try to interpret Narnia as a direct one-to-one representation of a biblical story, things just don't exactly line up. So what's going on here? Well, before we go any farther, we really need to ask the fundamental question: what exactly is an allegory? Now, sadly, for most modern students, the definition is usually a little fuzzy, mainly because we live in a world that says live your own truth and anything can be what you want it to be. And by now, most people just think that the word allegory has come to mean a story or an element of a story with symbolism or some deeper meaning. But in the words of Professor Kirk,
what do they teach in schools these days?
You see, just because a story has deeper meaning, it doesn't necessarily make it an allegory. Now, you may not have known this, but C.S. Lewis actually wrote an entire book about the use of allegory in medieval literature, and he even took the time to explain exactly what an allegory is. According to Lewis, an allegory is when intangible things like emotions and experiences and truths or principles are represented by tangible objects. So characters and objects stand in as symbols for those abstract concepts. It's like the story is a code, and the true meaning of the symbols are the key to unlock the code. Lewis put it this way: a strict allegory is like a puzzle with a solution. Now, because of that, allegories are kind of weird. They don't read like the stories that we're used to in modern day literature. Instead of rich, well-rounded, realistic characters, the characters are usually pretty flat, and they don't always act realistically because that's not their purpose. You see, their behavior is constrained because it's tied directly to the object that they represent. Now, one of the most classic examples of allegory is John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. And if you've ever read it, you'd agree that Prudence or Charity or Mr. Greatheart are not what we would call multidimensional characters. Another thing about allegories is that the stories themselves aren't really all that great. I mean, sure, there's value in what you're reading, and the lessons learned can be very compelling, but there's usually not much of a story arc, let alone plot twists and character development or foreshadowing or any of the other literary devices that we are so used to reading in our modern stories. That's because in allegories, the main point is to inform, not to entertain. The stories take a back seat to the underlying message. Now, some of the best examples of true allegories include Milton's Paradise Lost, Plato's Allegory of the Cave, Orwell's Animal Farm, and of course, one of Lewis's favorite, Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen. Now, of course, there are some blurry lines, and there are other works that are famous for their larger allegorical themes like The Scarlet Letter or Moby Dick or Lord of the Flies. Now that we know what allegory is, the question is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe an allegory? Well, we can already see that there are some real problems trying to place it in that category. First of all, there aren't really many one-to-one parallels in the book. Besides the obvious bits about Aslan, which we'll get to later, most of the similarities we see are just that. They're similarities. Peter is kind of like St. Peter, and Lucy is kind of like Mary Magdalene, and Susan is kind of like Mary's sister Martha, but not exactly. And there's really an important reason for that, because the most important clue that we have, the main reason we have to believe that Narnia is not an allegory, is because C.S. Lewis himself explicitly said so, and he said it numerous times. Now, I know I should have said this from the beginning, but I wanted to make the point. Here's exactly what C.S. Lewis said. Narnia is not an allegory, he said. Instead, it's something called a supposal. And this is the magic idea, because all of the Chronicles of Narnia are shaped around this concept. You see, the way Lewis explains it, a supposal begins by supposing, by asking the question, what if? In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Lewis asked the question, what if there was another world that needed saving? I did not say to myself, let us represent Jesus as he really is in our world by a lion in Narnia. I said, let us suppose that there was a land like Narnia, and that the Son of God, as he became a man in our world, became a lion there. And then imagine what would happen. So in Narnia, Aslan is not a symbol for Jesus. Aslan is Jesus. Now that's a big difference. When Aslan died and rose again to save Edmund's life in Narnia, he had already died and risen again to save Edmund's soul in our world. Aslan himself makes his true identity crystal clear by the time we get to the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, when he explains it to Lucy. In your world, I have another name. You must learn to know me by it. That was the very reason why you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there. And you know, Aslan reveals another secret here. It's the reason that we readers were brought to Narnia as well, so that we could know these truths, the truth, better in our world too. And not just know, but really know. You know, our hearts and our minds connect with these stories in a way that an allegory or a book of systematic theology never could. When you read Narnia as a supposal instead of an allegory, you stop spending your time trying to decipher a code, and instead, you join in on this incredible, limitless quest to discover the answer to the question, what if? And that's the question that makes all the difference. Because as Lewis explains, There is immense power in great stories. Here's how Lewis unpacked it. Some people seem to think that I began by asking myself how I could say something about Christianity to children, then drew up a list of basic Christian truths and hammered out allegories to embody them. This is all pure moonshine. I couldn't write in that way at all. Everything began with images: a fawn carrying an umbrella, a queen on a sledge, a magnificent lion. I thought I saw how stories of this kind could steal past a certain inhibition, which had paralyzed much of my own religion in childhood. Why did one find it so hard to feel as one ought to feel about God or about the sufferings of Christ? But supposing that by casting all of these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one can make them appear for the first time in their real potency? Could one not steal past these watchful dragons? I thought one could. See, here's why it really matters. Because when it all comes down to it, the Narnia stories aren't written to be dissected and interpreted, analyzed, or decoded. And I say that knowing exactly what kind of channel this is. But even so, above all else, the Narnian stories were meant to be enjoyed. They were meant to transport you into another realm, to take you places you've only dreamed of, to introduce you to people you'll never forget, and to send you on journeys that will leave you forever changed. Because I think C.S. Lewis put it perfectly when he wrote these words: "Sometimes fairy stories may say best what's to be said." Do you know the 3 most asked questions from parents who are searching for the right fit college for their student? Find the questions and the answers at boycecollege.com/faith.